Welcome to NYU Wagner. I'm Kim Johnson, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's event on Eric Klinenberg's new book, 2020, One City, Seven People, and the Year Everything Changed. Eric barely needs an introduction. One of the most important sociologists of his generation, Eric is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor in the Social Sciences and Director of the Institute of Public Knowledge here at NYU. Eric's work has been field defining. His first book, Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, explores important questions about community, race, and social ties. His second book, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, was, you might say, the autopsy of another disaster, namely the corporate takeover of local news in the United States. And his third book, a lot of books, Going Alone, Eric explains one of the most important demographic, economic, and cultural transformations in modern American life, the dramatic rise of single people living in American cities, a topic that he's explored more humorously but still rigorously in Modern Romance, a book that he co-authored with comedian Aziz Ansari about dating in the age of the phone app. And more recently, Palaces for the People, How Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, which uses our woefully underfunded but heavily used public library system to reflect on what is working and not working in America. All of these lead to his newest book on 2020. Eric will be interviewed by Tom Segru, Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History, Director of the NYU Cities Collaborative, and an affiliated faculty member here at Wagner. A historian of race and cities, civil rights, and American politics, Tom is author of many books, including The Origins of the Urban Crisis and Sweet Land of Liberty, The Forgotten Struggle for Civil Rights in the North. His most recent book, edited with Caitlin Zaloom, is his most recent book, edited with Caitlin Zaloom, is The Reader. Okay.
The ghost of 2020.
It just won't let go.
It's bringing up memories of the terrible Zoom meeting.
Right. I know. It really was a PTSD flashback. After the interview, we will have time for questions and answers from the audience. And most importantly, at the end, Eric's book will be for sale and you will happily sign copies. So welcome to Eric and Tom.
Thanks. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Kim, for the kind introduction, and to Wagner for inviting us all here. Am I on?
I think you were on.
I was on. Okay, great. I'm pretty loud, but I'll use this to save my voice. So thanks again, Kim, and to Wagner for hosting the event. The extraordinary events of 2020 have already generated a near library of scholarship. Over the last few years, it seems that every major foundation has funded original research on some aspect of that long year. COVID, racial inequality in policing, trust and distrust in government and authoritarian politics, just to name a few. From highly technical articles in The Lancet or the Annals of Internal Medicine to the special issue of Public Books on 2020 that I co-edited with Kate Saloom, from public health journals to government reports, I think Eric has probably read pretty much everything published on 2020 in preparation for writing this book. But Eric's book is not just a digest of other scholarship on 2020. Over the last several years, he has conducted surveys, done comparative research on public policy globally, crunched the numbers, and he has hit the pavement and done many, many interviews, including emergency doctors, janitors, and other so-called essential workers, Black Lives Matter protesters, and college students, among others. The results of this research are monumental. This is really an extraordinary book. What makes this book stand out? What makes this book stand out is Eric's synthetic imagination. He ties together all this material with real skill. And not only that, but he weaves through very contentious bodies of scholarship on some of the most hot button issues of the day, really judiciously, paying attention to both sides of arguments and often offering another one altogether that reflects his own deep thinking and original work on the subject. What also makes this book stand out are his powerful narrative abilities. This book is not only deeply researched and original, but, and I offer a rare accolade for a book by a social scientist, it's truly gripping. And often very moving. I read this book. I could have read it in one sitting. I didn't. I read it over a few days, but I could have read it in one sitting. It was so good. Eric writes compellingly about social structures, about social and economic and racial pre-existing conditions, about social capital and social distancing, about the commonalities and differences between the US, Canada, Britain, China, Australia, and many other countries. He writes about big picture questions like loneliness. And in a series of 7 powerful, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes hopeful vignettes of people across New York who experienced 2020 in different ways, he does what very few social scientific studies do. He really captures the humanity, the hope and loss, the love and fear, the frustration of people affected by the tragedies of 2020, including a Chinese American school principal struggling to hold her Lower East Side school together during lockdown, to the family of an Indian subway janitor who dies of COVID, and an increasingly bitter white bar owner on Staten Island who resists the lockdown. We will hear some of their stories tonight. So I want to begin, Eric, by asking you an open-ended question, which is, why did you choose to write this book? Why did you choose to kind of write the first big overview of 2020?
Well, before I answer you, can I just say thank you for doing this, and thank you to the Wagner School, to Kimberly, to all of you for being here. It's kind of amazing. Do you remember that moment, like about 4 years ago today, when we all thought, like, not only will we never be in a room together at NYU again, but New York might be over. And it's kind of I think it's worth just taking a second to look around the room and realize, like, here we are, hundreds of people gathering together face to face, kind of tight. But it's nice to be able to process things together. So what sometimes people ask me, like, what's your favorite idea from sociology? And I sometimes say, like, my favorite sociology idea is we're all free to make choices, but we don't get to choose the choices we have to choose from. And you ask why I chose to write this book. I kind of feel like I had no choice. I remember March of 2020 teaching in this room. So the sociology department until yesterday, more or less, was in this building. And I was teaching this undergraduate course on the social challenges of climate change. And one of the things I teach is this thing that psychologists call the paradox of cognition, which is like why it's so difficult to process and respond to things that are threatening and dire, but distant, like less urgent to us than the guys across the street with baseball bats at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so, like, we're kind of primed to respond to the really urgent thing, but not to the thing that's far away. And that's really important for making sense of why we have had such a hard time with global warming. And I was looking for an example 4 years ago for how to teach that. And I said, it was like late January, early February. How many of you are most concerned about this coronavirus? And I just remember this room full of students looked up at me like that was the craziest question they could imagine. Like, and there's one student who raised his hand, and it turned out he was from China, like he had just come over to study abroad. And then over the course of those weeks, I asked that question, and then suddenly it was the only thing that mattered. And I wrote this op-ed very early when I said, I understand this idea that there's social distancing, that the WHO is telling us we need social distancing. I think I know what they're trying to say, but what a dangerous idea social distancing is, because it's like it encourages all of us to go home, gather your family, close the door, let's wait it out until this pandemic is over, and then we'll be together again. And because I'd written this book about a heat wave where social isolation was the death of the city and of the most vulnerable people, I realized, like, that this is a really dangerous idea. So I wrote this op-ed saying, what we need is physical distance and social solidarity. And that should be the message for how we survive this thing we're about to go through together. And I started working on this kind of book-length essay about solidarity, and then I realized, like, to the extent that I have a superpower in life, it's not writing a book-length essay about solidarity. Nobody wants to read me doing that, but I do have this like part of my personality that likes to just get like obsessively involved in something complicated and dive into it. And I realized like my first human impulse when the pandemic started was to socially distance and just protect myself and my family. But then I also felt like, oh, if I'm not going to use this moment to figure out what's going on in the world, if I'm not going to do this, then why am I a sociologist? And so I just plunged in.
So one of the things that's really interesting and novel about this book is the way that you combine um, really rich biographical vignettes of 7 New Yorkers from different boroughs with a kind of a structural, social scientific, sometimes epidemiological, sometimes political analysis of what's happening in New York and in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about your choice to structure the book that way and why you decided to basically make the personal political or the big picture and small picture kind of together?
Yeah, so there's kind of a convergence of biographical things and also intellectual things that were happening that gave the book its structure, and just so you understand how it works, like the book opens with a narrative, and then I start to tell. Then I jump to the story of the first character, this woman Mei Lee from the Lower East Side, who is running the principal that she had attended as a child, and discovers in January and February that the Chinese American students who constitute almost everyone at PS 42 were either not coming to school or coming in masks, and the families were really upset, and the white parents didn't have any idea what was going on. And like the pandemic started in the Lower East Side and months before it started for other parts of the city. And so I was telling her story, and then it alternates between these analytic chapters where I try to take on some puzzle and a narrative chapter. And I think the reason that happened is I'm trained as a social scientist to think analytically, and I love to solve puzzles, like to do research that helps me answer a question that I don't already know the answer to. And the book is full of those things, like why is it that masks, which kind of people just wore in other countries, or they didn't wear, but not for political reasons, just because they didn't like them. How did they become so politically charged in the US, like to the extent that we were beating each other up in grocery stores or killing each other? Like how did that happen? Or why did violence, including reckless driving, spike in the United States, but not anywhere else, during that time? So there are those kinds of analytic questions. And I think one reason that I didn't just do the analysis is because, and I don't know how you all processed the experience of 2020. We can get to that later. But I felt like, as someone who was living through 2020 as a frail, vulnerable human being, as the child of older people, as the father of younger people, as a husband, as a colleague, like I felt very, I don't know, vulnerable myself. I felt like I was going through something that was very scary and intense and difficult. It was like, that scene in Mad Men in the very beginning with the credits where you see the guy like spinning in the vortex, and it felt like that kind of moment. Marx has this amazing line, "All that is solid melts into air," and it kind of felt that way. It felt like just unnerving. And what I realized in working on the book is that, to the extent that I just analyzed things, I wasn't really helping anyone understand the experiential makeup of that time. And it wasn't just that the experience mattered because I thought other people's stories needed to be there. I actually realized in that moment that there was something locked up in me. So there was so much going on in 2020. The book is not just about the pandemic, right? It's about the economic free fall in that moment when like millions of people lost their jobs, and we didn't know if NYU would have a school the next year. And then the murder of George Floyd and the assault on democracy and the hollowing out of New York City. There's so many things going on. And I think like everybody else, my defense mechanism was to kind of block it out and to try to put it in a box and move it into the closet. And what I started to feel when I read the interviews we're doing and thought about the situation is that we were all kind of blocked around 2020. Like we're dealing with this trauma by trying to make it disappear. and as I got deeper into the stories of people who I was talking to, I realized that listening to them and trying to relate to their experiences was helping me to unlock things in myself. And I thought, oh, what, like, to do both the two great things that sociology can do, both explanation and also advance understanding. The understanding is only going to come if I can really humanize the experience. And so at first I wanted to do it all around the world, but then the world was shut down. And then it hit me like, well, if you're going to study the world, New York City is a great place to be because the whole world is here. So then it became a question of like finding the right people to talk to.
I want to get into your analytic framework and your kind of big picture analysis, but since we're on the people, I want to talk a little bit more about a few of them because they were such compelling, well drawn portraits. I liked all of them, but there are a few that I really liked. And one of the more uplifting ones is a woman called Nuala O'Doherty from Jackson Heights in Queens. Jackson Heights, of course, is one of the neighborhoods that was most ravaged by the pandemic, especially in the early months, because it's home to so many migrants and essential workers. But she steps up and creates a mutual aid society, and her story is it has a lot of lessons actually for the bigger argument that you're making analytically. So can you talk about talk a little bit?
So I hope I've got her name right. I've been calling her Nuala, but you're the Irish American guy here. So now I've been screwing it up this whole time. So
stopped speaking Gaelic in 1922. So
okay. So Nuala O'Doherty is an extraordinary woman, and like basically my strategy was, and this is where this gets a little bit more artsy than scientific. So my sociology colleagues might want to cover their ears for the next few minutes. But I decided to get at this diversity of experience in New York. I would try to find someone from every borough, and I tried. This is the artsy part was I tried to say like, okay, what if I was going to tell the story of Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx, or Staten Island, like how would I tell that story? Like, what do I think the big trends were for those places? This is inexact. And then it was like, okay, well, once I've established that, are there people I've talked to in these interview projects that we've done, or people whose stories I heard from someone else whose lives kind of encapsulated, represent in some way that stuff. And so I found someone from every borough who did that. And then I thought to myself, like, well, what have I missed here? And I had missed the story of someone who died kind of early in the pandemic, which is how I got to the story of the man who was a custodian in the MTA. And then I also realized I had not gotten the story of someone whose life in 2020 was fundamentally about the movement for Black lives. And that's how Brandon English, who's on the cover of the book, is like amazing guy. That's how I wound up with him. So there's these 7 characters, and Nuala is one of several whose story is there because she helps us see that the story of 2020 was not just a story of cowering in our closets and distancing ourselves from one another. Nuala, she's Irish American from a family of immigrants. She's married to an Ecuadorian guy who is kind of like an auto technician. They live in Jackson Heights. They raised a family there. She worked as a DA for almost 30 years in Manhattan, retired, and was like thinking about trying to run for local office in Jackson Heights when the pandemic started. And she's always been one of those people who shows up at the school meetings and the neighborhood meetings and does stuff. And her campaign was kind of not going all that well. She'd never really done anything like that before. But when the pandemic started, she realized like Jackson Heights is a tough place. There's a lot of need there. There are a lot of people who are in the cash economy, the informal economy. A lot of people who are here without papers and aren't enrolled in public programs, and that they were likely to be really affected by a shutdown. So she put out this. She wrote like on a Post-it note, a little note like if you need help, call my number, and she put her cell phone there. And then she wound up making a Xerox copy of it and like turning it into a poster and putting it around Jackson Heights. And literally, like the first day, there were dozens of calls, and then there were hundreds, and then there were thousands. But the other thing she did is she did the same, like, if you can help, call me. And there were dozens, and then there were hundreds. And that was the beginning of this mutual aid society, this mutual aid network. They called it the COVID Care Neighborhood Network. And I actually talked to several people who participated in this project. And it's a story I think we really need to remember, because when we talk about, I'm sure we're going to get to the part of this conversation, we're going to wind up talking about all the things we really screwed up here, like all the ways in which we showed the worst of ourselves in the United States. And there's a lot of stuff that is tough. But there's another thing that we did, especially in neighborhoods, especially in kind of low income neighborhoods across the United States, which is that we bonded together and we helped each other out. And Nuala's story is really the story of a neighborhood network. It's just, she just happens to be the figurehead for it. And you see the evolution of this organization that emerged to deal with problems that the government wasn't solving. And they evolved over the course of the pandemic, so that first they dealt with hunger, and then they dealt with health and vaccines, and then it was creating this open street on 34th Avenue. And I caught up with her a few weeks ago. I wrote this magazine piece for New York Magazine on Nuala, and they said, well, just call her and see what she's doing now. And it's amazing, the basement of Nuala's house in Jackson Heights, which is the staging ground for the COVID care neighborhood network, it's now the Jackson Heights Immigration Center. And Nuala and a group of the same people who worked with her in the COVID care network, and also a bunch of new migrants, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they have 60 or so people every Monday, Wednesday, Friday come to her into her basement, and she does a free legal clinic. And she has single-handedly helped more than 2,000 families in New York register their papers to file for asylum, so that they can then get Social Security cards and work here. And so for me, that matters, because as despondent as we might get in this conversation, I'm glad we started here. Usually we end here, but we're going to start on a high note. Like, try to think about what would be going on, would be going on in the city were it not for this invisible civic infrastructure, or what would have happened in the pandemic were it not for these things. And actually, one of the things I learned in the course of doing this book is that people who were out there helping each other, and there are actually a lot of them in the book, I think they got a little less freaked out by the whole experience than people who just, socially distanced and tried to wait it out. And Nuala reminds me of that.
That's great. I guess we will have to move to a little bit of the gloom and doom.
We'll do a little sweep up and down like that, like a long bike
one
ride
of the
through the
reasons
hills.
that Nuala and other mutual aid societies were so important during the pandemic was the incapacity, sometimes failure of civic institutions of government to respond adequately to the crises of 2020. It's a story of failure in a lot of ways, even though it has a happy ending for her neighbors in Jackson Heights. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the central arguments in your book about what we might call, using the old sociological chestnut, the American exceptionalism question, which is, why did we botch it so badly? Not just during the pandemic, but afterwards, when, as you point out, we have a rise in crime, a rise in traffic deaths, almost entirely counter to what's happening in other countries around the world. What's going on here?
Yeah, so of course this is a big concern of mine, and I guess I want to put it in perspective first by saying that there are certain things that we botched very badly here, and I'm going to punch some of them out in a minute. But we weren't alone in failing, and I think it's important for us to know that. Like, it's a quite prestigious group of countries that that failed badly. It was a bad year for authoritarians. Bolsonaro didn't do so well in Brazil. China was a disaster in many ways. It's impossible to know exactly how much of a disaster it was, because the death rate estimates, or the excess deaths for 2020, the estimates are they vary by hundreds of thousands, depending on who you talk to. And by the way, I should say that's one reason that the book is both kind of analytic in the conventional social science sense and also narrative. We always need to be careful about trusting numbers, because we don't know where the numbers are from. But when you're trying to make sense of a situation where the numbers are suspect, like how many cases of COVID were there in China, how many people died, or what were the excess, there are all these things that are just very difficult to know. So we take this all with a grain of salt. But Boris Johnson lost his job over Partygate. Distrust in England went up. There are a lot of places that did very badly, and it's not that the US was the most deadly place you could be on Earth, but it was far more deadly than it needed to be. And we rank up there with the countries that bungled it. But the other thing about the US is that in addition to kind of the catastrophically high deaths, we really stand out in the extent to which we became more distrustful of each other, of government, of scientists. These are trends, by the way, that were happening before 2020. It's not like 2020 changed the direction of things, but they accelerated and intensified those trends, and they hardened them in some way. I wrote an essay a few weeks ago in the Times basically saying, you know, we talk about long COVID exclusively as a medical condition, and it is a medical condition, a serious one that we should be taking more seriously, but it's also a social condition. And like we're all still feeling the aftermath, or that we're still in it, that feeling of distrust and kind of disillusionment, that kind of blood boiling sense that we all have, like walking down the street and seeing someone who's not on our team, and maybe we'll get into that later. Like that's still such a big part of America today. I think also that feeling that so many people carry from the first months of the pandemic, which was like, it's not loneliness. It's like what I keep thinking of as structural isolation. The sense that core institutions aren't necessarily going to be there for you when you need them most. I think a lot of people felt that in March and April and May and June, like when they needed to figure out what was going on, people couldn't, and it wasn't at all clear where the support was going to come. And when it finally did come, it was uneven, and then it disappeared a year later. So there's all this stuff, but I think the trends were bad for us going into it. Remember when 2020 started, we were impeaching the president. We were already entering into what was supposed to be the most important election of our lifetime, when everything was on the line. Like we were already kind of ready for a conflict. And then I think we were horribly, horribly misled. I really do think we were misled. And I try to avoid writing too much about the last president in this book, because it tends to somehow like dominate everything and also occlude critical thinking. It's just kind of there. And I didn't want to, every time I started writing about him, I tried to put the brakes on, like, does anybody really want this? Like, is this the thing that people need from me? You know, and so I don't hit it much, but there's certain parts of the American experience that people don't quite remember that were like especially chaotic and devastating. And I just want to hit a couple of them on the kind of federal policy side. And, you know, by the way, Mayor de Blasio, who teaches in, you know, in this school, you know, you probably remember in the early days when like the city was about to shut down and COVID was in New York, and he was like, we're going to shut down soon, but before we do, get yourself to a great restaurant and enjoy New York. Like, make sure you go to the theater. Broadway is rocking, you know? And he like listed movies that he thought you should go and see. Like we were really unable to, it's magical thinking, right? I mean, the American exceptions, there's a little magical thinking here, like the stuff that the rest of the world has to deal with. Like we're good, we got this. So, and we should share the blame. And Cuomo, like, you know, fabricated the death reports. He suppressed the death data from nursing homes. You know, so it's not, I don't want to just pick on the people who are running the country, but the people who are running the country are running the country. So 2 quick moments here. Some of you might remember the early days. One of the opening parts of the book is the early days of the pandemic. There were these, anyone ever been on a Princess cruise? You know the Princess Cruise Lines? Yeah, you'll have to tell us about it in the book signing later. So the Princess Cruise Company, they sent the Diamond Princess left port in Tokyo, and the Grand Princess left port in San Francisco. And they both got COVID on board. And like the Diamond Princess got welcomed back to Japan. And it's a long story, but basically like they did a bunch of things that were as responsible as they could be and learned from it scientifically. And there were deaths and there were people who got sick, and it wasn't perfect, but like Japan decided it was going to take advantage of the situation to learn as much about how COVID spreads and what you can do to prevent it and how to manage it as a public health crisis. And you probably remember this moment. The Grand Princess is out at sea, and there's thousands of Americans on it, and the president says, like, no, we're not letting you back on shore. I was like, what do you mean you're not letting us back in charge? Like, and this is where he says, like, I like the numbers where they are. You know, I like the numbers where they are. And I mean, it's important to register that I actually have something to say about this issue about leadership and crises. Like, he said the other day, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And I thought, like, that's not how that line goes. You're not supposed to say it that way. Like, everybody knows it's, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago when he was the president, right? But what he's saying is, like, just don't even think about that year. Didn't happen. That year didn't happen. And that's like, that's kind of sounds funny, but there's another way to think about it, which is like, it shouldn't count. That's like seriously the point. That's how they're going to run. It shouldn't count because, yeah, it's just a weird year. But it's like when you're voting for a political leader, one of the things you have to be asking, especially like climate change, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, like you pick your thing. It's like, how is that leader going to handle crises? So like you want to assess a leader on how well equipped they are for a crisis. You don't get to say, pretend it didn't happen. So the first moment of magical thinking is, I'm not letting people back on shore. So then finally, after a lot of embarrassment, they let the Grand Princess come back. It is not allowed back in San Francisco. You know where it lands? Where? Oakland. And so I used to, I went to graduate school in Berkeley, and I don't get too carried away with this, but like San Francisco is like this gem, this beautiful, wealthy gem of a city. Oakland is like black, it's Latino, it's working class. They put it at the port. Okay, so there's that. Then they bring the Americans come on board. They haven't communicated with people like what's going on. They don't tell people why they're up. Everyone knows it's COVID, but no one knows how much of it. They load people onto buses and planes, and they bring Americans and everyone else to like military bases and hotels where they try to quarantine them and test them for COVID. But there's like hundreds of people who say, no, you can't quarantine me. I'm American. I'm free. I'm going home. And they refuse to be quarantined, and they go, and then they sue. This thing ends in lawsuits, right? So that's like part one. I like the numbers where they are. Part two, and this is so important for the story of like how we got so divided. The first few months of the pandemic, the WHO is not telling people to wear masks, right? They're nervous that there aren't enough masks in the world, and they want to make sure there's enough for essential workers and healthcare workers. So they say, we're not recommending them. But then the science starts to come in like late March and early April, the CDC realizes like we got to have a mask guideline. We got to tell people to wear masks in public. So, and also, by the way, like you hear Americans complain about the lockdowns and the shutdowns and all this stuff, but like what we went through here was nothing compared to so many other countries, including France and Italy. Like we really didn't lock it down here. But the CDC says like, okay, we want people to wear masks. So the person who makes this announcement is the last president. And he gets on television, it's April 3rd, and he says like, CDC's now changed their tune. The new message is like, the guideline in America is wear a mask when you're in public. Reasonable point, right? I mean, personally, I'm not going to do it, he says. I don't know about this mask thing, right? Now, this is where the sociology becomes really important. And I think like we haven't spent enough time talking about this. So now it becomes clear to everybody in the last president's orbit that wearing a mask is a sign of weakness, of fear, right? Bearing your face is like a sign of fealty. You're on my team, we're doing this thing. So Mike Pence, you remember this? Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic. The sickest people go to try to get help. And he refuses to wear a mask. So these photographs are like Mike Pence is with the doctors and the nurses and the patients, and he's smiling, right? And so it becomes clear, like, if you're on that team, you bear your face. Okay, now, Tom Segru sees this. He's like, that's wrong. That's a terrible thing. I believe in wearing a mask. I believe in science. I believe in mutual obligation. I believe in public health. So Tom changes his Facebook photograph. Tom's got a mask on his Facebook image now. Think about all the friends you know who suddenly had like their face masks on. And then, right, Kate changes her like Twitter hash. She's like on Twitter, she's like, Kate, hashtag wears a mask, Zaloom. Right? And then all the Democratic presidential candidates start doing campaign ads with masks on. Do you remember this? And now, like, I'm walking down the street and like I go into the grocery store and I see this guy and he's got a mask on. I'm like, yes, you're on my team. Nice, we got a mask on, right? And there's like, Jonathan Rose doesn't have a mask. Jonathan Rose, you're gonna kill me. Remember, did anyone have that feeling? Like you're walking somewhere and like you see someone who's not wearing a mask and you're like, oh my God, you're gonna kill me and my whole family. And what's wrong with you? You're destroying this country. And it was like it wasn't wrong, that feeling. Like it was selfish, but like suddenly the face mask, this little piece of fabric, was carrying all of this political weight, right? Because it had become not just a mask. It wasn't just a health device. It was a totem, a symbol of like who we are and what we believe in. And first it was the mask, and then it was the medicine, right? Oh, that you got remdesivir. I've got the hydrochloroquine. I can never do that one, but right? Remember then there was Democrat and Republican medicine. And then it was the vaccine. And then it was the election. And it just spiraled into these symbols of like who we were. And now so why did America get so dysfunctional? In part because I think leadership always matters, but in a time of uncertainty, in a time when there's been a major trauma and stress, like we really look to our leaders in a different way. We look to our leaders to give us a narrative. We're a little bit more open to following their lead. Like, remember all the Democrats who were down with the war in Iraq after 2003, right? Or after 2001, sorry, after 2000, like, remember the sentiment for Bush after 2001? Like, we're willing to go there. Like, we don't know. And we, at a moment when we really needed to be led, and when there actually was a strategy, there was like a right-wing strategy that could have led to solidarity. It might have had lots of other dangerous things, but there was a way for a strong man to have, like, you know, masks with Trump on them, right? And call the vaccines like Ivana vaccine and Ivanka vaccine, right? Like that, you could have done it that way. I'm not saying that would have been great, but like you could have imagined a different story, but instead, like, we got chaos. And I think the experience of being in America at that time that overrides everything was just the sense of like, it's chaotic out there and we don't know who to trust. And like one thing that there's a chapter in the book about young people in their 20s. Actually, I gotta stop for 1 second to say, there's a really special person in the room tonight who I want to shout out, Isabel Carluzzi, who was in my social challenges of climate change class upstairs when this started. And she had this amazing, she's an NYU, brilliant undergrad. She's like the undergrad in your class who you always want to have because she answers every question when no one else has done the reading. And she was going to start this job in Italy right after she graduated in May 2020, like this dream job. But then of course, like that dream job was gone and everything was gone. And she moved back home to be with her parents. And I realized at some point, like when I was starting this project, like I need some brilliant person to help me out with this. And I reached out to Isabel and she came and worked with me on this project and is now getting a PhD in sociology at NYU. So she's right here in the second row.
Another upside of the pandemic.
A huge upside. So I thought of Isabel because like one thing we wanted to understand is like the experience of people in their 20s in the year 2020. And she did, I did some of them with her, but she did the lion's share of these interviews with people in their 20s. And the thing that so many people in their 20s expressed is the sense that like, I don't know that they're grown-ups in the room here, taking care of this. I don't know that I believe that the people who are in charge have a plan. And like anybody who thought like, oh, well, if things get really bad, like the smart people are going to come in and they're going to take care of stuff. Like 2020 wiped away that fantasy. And because now we have climate change coming and because democracy is in question and because of Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan, and you name the thing, I think like there's a big thing happening in the country right now, which is all these people in their 20s who came out and voted for Biden in this moment of faith, who now don't think that like that worked out in the way that they wanted it to. whether it's his fault or not, like they're saying they might not vote, and their trust in core institutions is plummeted, right? And this kind of sense of despondency about the leadership, the state of the country, that's a real thing we have to deal with, and that's part of the legacy of 2020.
Mm-hmm. One of the most interesting chapters in the book, for me, a father of a 25-year-old and a 22-year-old, in other words, my son was a freshman in college and my daughter was a senior in college in 2020, was reading about the struggles and the perspectives of that generation. One of the manifestations, a puzzle, as you would put it, that happens in 2020, involving people like my daughter and my son and millions of others, were of course the wave of protests after the murder of George Floyd. I was doing a quintessential pandemic thing. I was on a Zoom call with a friend of mine in Philadelphia that I hadn't seen in some time. We usually get together, every month or so and go out for a beer. And we were chatting about politics and protests. And all of a sudden, on Canal Street in front of my apartment, I heard chanting and marching and drums. And I looked out and turned my computer over so he could watch. And then about a minute later, I got a text from my daughter saying, "Dad, just walked past your apartment." So one of the questions that I want to pose about 2020 is that many look at May and June of 2020, one of the darkest moments, a manifestation of distrust in institutions, but also the moment of what is arguably the largest mass protest and most sustained period of mass protest in American history, somewhere between 15 and 26 million people taking to the streets, is a sign of hope, a sign of possibility, or is it a sign of division, or is it both? Let's talk.
Well, I mean, we should talk because Tom wrote a great essay about this, and historian of civil rights and race and social justice in America. I mean, we're now in your sweet spot. But it was, of course, it was both of those things, right? I mean, it was enormous expression of hope, and maybe you remember this moment too, where like summer is late May. It's outrageous. We're angry. It's infuriating. Murder is horrific, and I think there's this like accumulation of suffering and frustration at the lockdown and the social distance and anger about not just George Floyd's murder, but also just like the murder by public policy that we saw across America in 2020, and like the betrayal of the most vulnerable people, like the people who are dying in nursing homes, which is a huge story I address in the book, because it's a labor story, actually. Like the reason people died in nursing homes at that incredible rates, yes, there are vulnerable people, but also like we have contingent labor in nursing homes. Not all countries have nursing homes this way. Like, so people who work in American nursing homes tend to work in several different institutions because they don't have like a full job that takes care of their bills in one company. And so either they work for a company that sends them to different places, or they kind of work for a few days in one place and a few days in another place. So they were the carriers of the disease, right? And the conditions of the nursing homes are pretty bad, especially in the for-profit nursing homes. And people were more exposed to one another. And so like we're experiencing and witnessing this horrible vulnerability and the inequities by age and by race and by class, like the essential workers. Like we pause for essential workers for a second. Like there's this amazing thing how I always say, like, crises have this way of revealing who we are, what we value, right? Whose lives matter. And we came up with this category, essential workers, in the beginning of the pandemic. And it was like, what a lovely honorific that is, We treasure you, essential workers. Like, you would think it would come with respect. And there was, of course, in New York, like the banging of the pots and pans, which was a beautiful expression of solidarity. But that was just a small number of the essential workers. Like the most of the essential workers didn't get that. Like in America, what it meant to be called essential was not that you got healthcare guaranteed or you got like a bonus or a handshake. To be called essential in America was to be deemed expendable, right? And so we knew that, and we watched it all. And there was no way to express this thing that was going on. And we watched the buffoonery from political leaders. And then George Floyd gets murdered by police. And it's like, there's this great sociological concept called biographical availability.
Mhm.
It's originally referred to protesters in the civil rights movement. This great book by Doug McAdam called Freedom Summer. Like, why do some people protest? Because they're biographically available. Like, why are so many students on college campuses now out protesting what's going on in the Middle East? They're taking 3 or 4 classes a semester. They got time on their hands. They can do it, right? Biographical availability. Well, in May and June of 2020, America had biographical availability. I mean, like, we were ready to go, and people came out, and it was an incredible expression of hope. And if you read the book, I know you're going to read the book, everybody. If you read the book, like Brandon English's story is it's an amazing story of like being swept up into this thing, and to feel that thing, like, okay, now there was this sense emergent, another world is possible, right? And the U.S. did fail to provide social protection in so many ways, but like now, like there was stimulus, and the people were getting paid. Like, not everybody, and there's stories in the book of people who slipped through the cracks, but like it was okay. Like, people were not starving. Like, the mutual aid was working. Like, there was a glimmer of hope. Like, maybe we're going to remake the country. But there was also anger and violence, and not every protest was peaceful, right? And the windows got broken, and there was, right, and then the police were violent, and it wasn't clear who was doing was it the protesters doing the violence? Was it the right that was coming in to do? No one trusted anyone. So there was an expression of violence, as there often is during moments of upheaval as well, and that fed into it. So I think it was a moment of hope and creativity, and it was also a moment of rage and violence, and that mixed up jumble never quite got processed. I mean, I think a lot of that energy did pour into the election. And for those of you who, care about the presidential election, 2020 might have come out differently had it not been for the pandemic and all of that energy. Like, America got mobilized. Like, something that energy from the summer drove a lot of the politics too. But the ambitions, like the things that we thought might be possible in terms of movement for Black lives and the reckoning, reparations, like that didn't really go where the most hopeful people thought it might go. I don't think it did. Why do you think it turned out the way it did?
Why do I think it
Tom
turned out the way
Segru,
it did? Well,
distinguished American historian.
well, it's your show, not mine, so I'll go quick answer. But I think one of the major factors playing into the trajectory of protests is that the election came on, drew a lot of energy away, as you suggested. I think the biographical availability is a plus and a minus. Getting 15 to 26 million people onto the street is one thing. Getting them to begin to build the institutional infrastructure that's so important for long-term social movements is a lot more difficult. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes vision, it takes trust in institutions to be able to build that kind of social infrastructure necessary for long-term change. That said, there's a lot going on. I think no one would have predicted in 2011 that the Occupy movement would lead to the question of inequality moving to the center of American political debate, even global political debate, right? Of social scientific research. And after Occupy was over, I thought, flash in a pan, it's not going to amount to anything. Yet if you take a look at everything from an engrams of the use of the language inequality to Thomas Piketty's massive 680-page book on inequality going onto the bestseller list, something did happen.
Yeah.
So we don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict with any great certainty,
Yeah.
looking into our cloudy crystal balls, what's going to happen.
I mean, I think
in the aftermath of 2020.
that's such a good point. It helps to explain the virulence of this attack on DEI, right? And the virulence of the attack on the university as a space for free thinking. And also for the parts of the university that are really committed to social justice. That's like one reason why I think that's, that becomes such an important front in this battle. But I also think it's one reason why it was important to me to write the story of NULA and to talk about the mutual aid societies and this thing I think of as this invisible civic infrastructure, because that is part of who we are in the United States right now. And like I actually think in this year, there's going to be a big question of what part of ourselves we channel and who organizes where and who, how do we get engaged? And there's like a part of me that often feels really despondent. I mean, there's something that makes me really despondent about this moment within universities and within the city. And then like spending time in Jackson Heights, which I want to say also, like we talked about the good things that happened there. Like Jackson Heights got crushed in the pandemic. Like this is, Jackson Heights is part of this cluster of neighborhoods like Corona and Elmhurst and Rego Park. They just got crushed from COVID because the formula for disaster in COVID was having someone in your household be a participant in the essential workforce, right? Someone who had to go out and work, but also having residential crowding. It wasn't density in neighborhoods that made people like vulnerable. That's what we thought at first. Like density is the problem. It wasn't actually density that was a problem. It was residential crowding. And so this cluster of neighborhoods that got really hard hit were neighborhoods that had people who were going to work every day, generally without PPP, and then also lots of other people at home spreading the disease. And so like, so I think we just note that like there's a chapter in the book that's on neighborhoods and why neighborhoods came out the way they did in New York, and not just the obvious like everybody in Manhattan was in the Hamptons so they didn't get sick, like more than that. And but I think there is this story that you find in these like kind of dense, crowded immigrant neighborhoods that people found a way of supporting one another and building structures that provided mutual aid and got people engaged in a street level politics. And like we've talked about kind of government failure. And I think like one really big question now is, do the Americans who experience government failures and organize locally to compensate feel like, screw it, government's not the solution. I don't need to vote. Doesn't matter. Like, let's build for this other thing. Or is the sentiment more like, we can do so much, but like the only way we're really going to do this is if we mobilize and support each other and engage in politics. And like Nuala is trying to get public resources to support her Jackson Heights Immigration Center because she realizes she needs public funding to do it, to scale it up right now. But that's a big thing because we're in this moment where I think there's a temptation for people to drop out or to say, yeah, like Trump messed it up, but Cuomo was corrupt also. They're all crooks, and that's a very dangerous sentiment as well. By the way, hold on. Nuala O'Doherty just walked in the room. We're talking about you.
Great.
Nuala, I called you out before we started, Nuala, Tom Segru, who you can't see because there's a lectern in front of you. And you can come up to we have seats for you where you can see. She's got nothing else going on. Tom just says, yeah, sit there.
Well, this is.
He said, I really want to. He said, after that, I've got to meet Nuala. I have to meet her. So now you can meet Nuala.
Well, I could keep asking questions all night, and I have 3 pages more worth. But you're all here, and I want to open up the floor for questions to Eric. I only ask that you keep it short, so as many of you as possible can get a voice in. And I will start over here. I'm going to stand now so I can kind of spot you.
Great, yeah. And Kenneth, you got a mic too, right?
Yeah. Oh, here.
Wait for the mic because I think for Zoom we need the mic.
Is that good?
Hey, Niobe.
Is this good? Okay. Hi, Eric. How are you? Really fantastic book. I've read it, and really, I love it. So it's fantastic. And I'm going to be quick about the question. So there's something interesting about. I remember the thing in psychology. You say oftentimes when you get to the bottom of the barrel is in alcoholism is when you realize you're an alcoholic and willing to change. And I oftentimes think of 9/11 and 2020 as the 2 moments that we got to the bottom of the barrel, at least within New York City. And we actually changed positively in some ways. We saw our own problems around racism. And interestingly enough, it's not just around racism and inequality that we saw our own problems through 220, but we also started to change culturally around our value of friendships. And I say that as a researcher of friendships. Nobody was paying attention. I've been writing about friendship 15 years for boys and men. I've been writing about it. Nobody paid attention. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden, everybody's recognizing that people need friends and that romantic relationships cannot be privileged any longer. You may have to actually value our effing friendships. But it took COVID for us to get to the bottom of the barrel. So I'm curious about these collective traumas. And for New Yorkers who's lived through 9/11 too, it's also a collective trauma. When it's sort of premised on, we're blaming 9/11 for Muslims, and we blame the Chinese for 2020. When it's sort of around blaming other people for our suffering versus Sandy Hook or the heat wave, right, in Chicago, do you actually get to that bottom of the barrel more? You get what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Like, do you see yourself more when you're actually in the process of sort of blaming others for the suffering?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I was just learning from you there, Niobe. So that was, yeah, I don't know that I have it. I mean, yeah.
Others can be benefits.
So, yeah, well, no. So we're used to this idea that, it's foolish to, you should always exploit a crisis, right? Like, you'll never let a good crisis go to waste. And I like, that's kind of like my calling card for my professional life. It's like, it's kind of why I felt Tom's first question, like, why did you choose to write this book? Like, choose to write this book? Like, I had to write this book, because it's my belief that, institutions reveal themselves when they break down. You really do see something about a society when it's dealing with a situation like this. Like, I think, like, for me, that's the power of this essential worker thing. Like, we created a category, right? Like, we're at the bottom of the barrel. The economy can't work anymore. Let's figure out who's really valuable here and whose labor is really valuable. No, it's not you, banker dude, right? It's not you, lawyer guy. It's not you, professor, really. Sorry. It's like this set of people. And so there's the revelation there, right? And it was like, we create this concept. And so here, this is where I'm kind of pushing against it. It's like we get to the edge of the moral precipice. It's like, ooh, we're going to name it and say it and change. And then we're like, nah, let's go back. And so I think that a crisis can do that. But the reason I feel like I have to do the work, like, why did I write the book, is because the temptation for us when it's over is to just go back and act like it didn't happen. That's why I wrote the heat wave book, right? Which Chicago did not process at all. One of the best books about the great influenza pandemic of 1918 is called America's Forgotten Pandemic. And it actually, like, there was this great essay about my book in the New Yorker magazine yesterday. And Adam Gopnik, who's such a brilliant writer, starts it with like a little review of this book by historians about why we failed to process the great influenza of 1918. How do we make that disappear? And I think, like, we're all complicit, not because we're evil, but like, I want to ask this of you really seriously, just to think about yourself personally. Remember all the stuff, all these things that we were talking about here that we went through in 2020, all the, like, the collective traumas and also the personal anxieties. Like, is my parents going to make it through this? Like, am I going to make it through this? Why does my kid have a fever and isn't getting off the couch? And I'm curious about this. How many of you personally feel like you've really processed what you went through in 2020? Like, you've really thought about it. You kind of understand what happened to you. You've thought about how it shaped the way you think about the city and your friends. Can you just raise your hand really high so I can count? I'm a sociologist. So you have one man. It's only.
So is there a question over here?
So yeah, so it doesn't have to be that.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for this. And stand up. I'm curious, and this is actually a question that came up earlier in a grad seminar that I read with your wife, as to how much this is a story of New York versus a story of the United States, or even our kind of global moment.
So the way the book works is that it jumps between these different scales. So there's like one part of the book is very comparative and international, and you see the American experience in the context of other experiences. So like the first analytic chapter in the book takes up the very simple question, like, what's the first thing that these 5 different countries did when they found out that there was a new coronavirus? And it's like these one set of countries, the US, the UK, and Australia, all kind of small L liberal, countries, all run by right-wingers, at the time. Very different responses. And then there's China and Taiwan. And so like, and there's comparisons threaded through the book like that, masks, violence, all these things. So there's one part, and then one part is deep, deep, deep into New York. And there's, of course, like inevitably a lot about this book and this experience is very much about New York. But I think, and this is going to sound weird to people who, do social science for a living, but there's a way in which like the beauty of the writing very intimate profiles of people is that I think in a funny way, you wind up getting at something much more universal and widely shared. And like Nuala, like writing Nuala's story, I was writing about this very specific kind of extraordinary woman in one neighborhood, in one borough, in one city. But when you read Nuala's story, like I think, it's my hope, this is what happened to me, like listening to Nuala's story, it's like you see all these things in yourself and in people around you that you can connect to. And for me, that's like the thing that unlocked something and that made like the book a much more personal thing. So I would say, is it a New York story? Yeah, this is to the extent that the Heatwave book was my Chicago story, this book is my New York story. But also, I think it's really much more than that.
Thanks, Eric. I was struck by your commentary on on mutual aid groups in Jackson Heights. I'm wondering if you could tell us what lessons you think governments should learn from these mutual aid groups and how we address food insecurity and reaching and making sure that people get access to these public assistance programs that they're eligible for, but often don't get them.
I mean, I'm going to say something, and I kind of would like to pass the mic to Nuala to say what it means to get public sector support, because like what I learned talking to Nuala and to other people who participated in mutual aid projects is that, like, yes, they were able to do an extraordinary number of things to make sure that people got fed and got basic goods, but also that, and just as I think Nuala is able to do extraordinary things to help people get, their asylum paperwork together, but that there's clearly like collective capacities that we have and resources that the government has that would be kind of better distributed at the right scale if we had a stronger way for the Nuala O'Dohertys of the world to work with them and to get plugged into them. And it seems to me like it was difficult for local neighborhood organizations to plug into those networks when they needed it. So like there's a long tradition of these public-private partnerships in the US. Like it's not just like the state doesn't have tentacles everywhere. We have, organizations all over the country that are using public money to deliver services. But I think one thing we learned in the crisis is that we need a much stronger, more efficient way to plug the hyper-local stuff into the public resources. Is that fair, Nuala? Does that seem right?
So I've got really specific requirements. I send these emails out regularly. It's really simple. What we need to do is have that infrastructure built in. And I think if Hurricane Sandy didn't show it to us, if 9/11 didn't show it to us, if the local building fire on your corner didn't show it to us, is that it takes a long time for the government to react. And what you want is this network of mutual aid groups who have enough funding so they have their website, they have their computer and their printer there ready, so that when the big fire happens on the building in the corner, they can jump in that night and help and not wait 6 months for an RFP to then respond and have it responded to, blah, 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 blah. So what the city needs to do is really just invest in these small neighborhood mutual aid groups, and they are just this tiny stopgap until the big guys come in to help, right? And so kind of like why you should learn CPR while you wait for FDNY to come.
So Kenny's got someone over here, and then we have 2 questions here.
Hi, yeah. So this is very exciting. I haven't yet read the book, but I'm excited to go and do it after this talk. I was really interested in your account of how kind of masks came to be partisan as someone who's sitting here wearing a mask. But I was kind of intrigued because vaccines don't seem to follow the same story that you tell, which is you have a story where Trump says, I'm not going to wear a mask, and then it kind of becomes partisan. But he's really pro-vaccine and has always been really pro-vaccine because he views it as like his achievement, Operation Warp Speed. And even today, he'll get pushback on this and he'll still be vociferously pro-vaccine. So I'm curious why vaccines didn't have a different.
I mean, I have a different take on that than you do, which I think he's been very mixed on it, to be honest. And I think this is like one of the great tragedies of this part of the experience, because I'm not going to say that that government is responsible for the fast development of the vaccines. We really lucked into this because the mRNA technology was ready. It took the scientists would say it took us a day or two, and we knew that it was going to work. But what I think we can acknowledge is the White House removed a huge number of regulatory hurdles that would have slowed down the development and the distribution of the vaccine. And had Trump won the election, he would have gone out and said, everybody needs to get this vaccine. Here's me on television getting the vaccine. It's the Trump vaccine. But we know that's not what happened. What happened instead is that, you might remember this, by the time and he was trying to get the vaccine distributed before the actual election itself. He wanted people seeing it, but the FDA wasn't ready to do it. When it rolled out, when it was ready, he had lost the election. January 6th hadn't happened yet, but he had lost the election. And we know that he did not want Biden to get credit for what he thought of as his victory. So he withheld his endorsement. So sometimes he says, yes, I'm pro-vaccine, but he never did the thing that presidents have done before, which is to go on television and get vaccinated. He did not endorse it. And he did not push back all that much until much later on right-wing leaders who disparage the vaccine. And so I just have a different take on the story.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent conversation. I think my next question is, what comes next, right? So 2024, we're approaching what will be a very contentious election. We're in the middle of an epidemic of loneliness. Where do you see us going as a city?
Don't ever wind me up with the epidemic of loneliness question again. Everybody who's my friend here knows. If you really want to start me, no, I'm just kidding. So can we jump over the epidemic of loneliness debate for a moment here? Can we talk about 2024? All right. So the thing about that is going to be a tough year, right? We got a big year ahead of us. The thing about, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? Why that matters so much is because there's nobody in America who has a greater vested interest in us forgetting what happened in 2020 than the guy who's running for president on the Republican ticket. As we talk about this, what's at stake for America, there's no one who has more to gain from us not remembering the chaos, the disorder, the dysfunction, the violence, the distrust that we produced to some great extent, I think, because of political leadership. I mean, there are studies that show disinformation, so there's massive, research on where did disinformation about COVID come from? Some huge percentage of it from the president's office, from the White House. I think this is a really big issue. As we adjudicate who to vote for in 2024, there will be more crises. When we vote on someone, we're voting on who's going to be managing those things. Now, do I know what's really do I understand this mysterious percentage of the American electorate that's I don't know who to vote for, just waiting for the evidence, I just can't figure it out, I just don't know, I'm just gonna have to see what they say in the debate. As a sociologist, I find this the most puzzling thing in the world. So I can't say that processing 2020 is going to help, but I really do think it's important for us to take seriously this part of the experience, in addition to taking seriously all the other things that people are saying. And I'm really the mission of me writing this book and having it come out now is it feels to me like there's some urgency about it. And it's partly because of this idea about long COVID as a social disease. Like I really do think that we're carrying this stuff with us. But I also think like we need an accounting, and we need to not just believe as like in the absence of a story about what happened to us in 2020, all of these revisionist histories have flourished, including the like, actually Florida was better than any other place, which is not right. It's not right. So I think it's important for us to process this, but also like the fact that when I asked this room of super educated, erudite, serious people, how you processed, if you processed this year, arguably one of the most important and memorable years of your life, that one person who I don't really trust, but he is a philosopher. So one person, I mean, like, I think we haven't done it, and we haven't done it at our peril.
We have time for one last question. You've been waiting, and
Yeah, thank you.
And then Eric will be ready to sign.
Okay, this is a related question, I guess. The New York Times had an article either today or yesterday about burnout and exhaustion. And I'm wondering if that's a little different in terms of the legacy of 2020, and it's more like a version of long COVID, obviously not medically, but just exhaustion, and how we motivate people, as you somehow have done that, Nuala, how we motivate people to not be too exhausted right now.
For the record, I was not.
Fire us up, coach. We're going.
Yeah, I'm trying to like summon my inner high school soccer coach. What can I say about this moment? I mean, I think we are exhausted, and interestingly, like there was a brilliant woman named Melina Sherman who came to work with me as a postdoc on this project. We got funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do this research, I should say, and there are a lot of really wonderful people who participated in this project, which, like, my name is on the book, but there's a lot of other people who really were part of it. Isabel, obviously, central. Melina and I interviewed nurses who are the kind of they're the great case of burnout. It's a crisis in the healthcare industry right now that like nurses are quitting. And the framework we use is like burnout. And we actually reject the concept of burnout because it kind of puts the onus of responsibility on the nurses. Like, oh, well, you burned out. You couldn't keep your fire lit, And we think instead it's better to talk about what happened in hospitals as a case of like moral injury or moral suffering. Like people in the healthcare sector worked in institutions that didn't really allow them to do their jobs in a way that worked, and they carried the burden of that. And so like of course, like people feel that sense of injury, like they couldn't provide the level of care that they wanted to provide to feel good about themselves. And honestly, when you talk to nurses about what it felt like to have people bang the pots and pans and treat them as heroes, on the one hand, it was great, but also they all said it was really hard for me because I knew that in the hospital, I wasn't able to provide the level of care. Like you wouldn't believe what I just did in the hospital. And there are more. And there's of all the seven people in the book who are characters, 2 of them work in the public school system in New York. So there's a lot of what the public school teachers did. And we haven't talked about Mei Lee or Numa Menketti, but you're right, Naomi, they're important. They're important. So I think like one way to think about this is to change the framing a little bit. And instead of like getting down on ourselves for being burned out, I think this is back to this question before, I think we need a reckoning with what we lived through. And if we recognize that the source of some of our struggle is not that like, I just don't have it in me, and more like at a moment when we needed solidarity, we got structurally isolated. We were left to fend for ourselves. It calls for a different kind of response. And we're going to need to summon up the kind of response that we summoned in the summer of 2020 in this next year. Because like 2020 was a tough year, 2024 is going to be something else. All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
It's great.